On 30th of January 2025, Caribbean Women in Trade, CWIT, held the 2024 Caribbean Trade Year in Review. The event began with a panel which explored major events influencing Caribbean trade. Three esteemed panelists explored the key trade-related issues with which they and/or their constituents dealt in 2024 and explored issues that they might face in 2025. Ms. Keisha Farnham, Head of Partnerships and Programs, Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, discussed business and trade opportunities through addressing climate change and energy efficiency. Ms. Dawn Spicer, Executive Director, Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, explored improving trade by strengthening financial regimes. The recording begins with Dr. Janice Remy, Director, Sridhar Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services with the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus in Barbados, discussing the World Trade Organization's 13th Ministerial Conference, Outcomes and Implications for the Caribbean.
If you speak with a lot of people, including our Caribbean delegates, they would say that not everyone just wanted to make sure that no harm was done rather than expecting any seismic shifts in the negotiating palette. So for CARICOM, and I think for a lot of members, the fisheries subsidies negotiations, phase 2, they call them, was a core negotiating issue. So if you recall, the previous MC12, there had been some movement in moving towards ending subsidies, so certain types of subsidies in fisheries. And this was important because it's specifically listed at one of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it had been elusive for the last 20 years. But CARICOM members, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Haiti, St. Lucia, went in having signed up to phase 1 of the negotiations that covered things like prohibition of certain types of subsidies relating to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, overfished stocks being banned, and prohibition of subsidies on unregulated high seas. And the task was really to try to move to restricting subsidies on overfishing. That proved unsuccessful in the sense that there was the disagreement over something very near and dear to CARICOM member states, which was special and differential provisions for developing countries. And I'll leave that there because I'm sure you're going to have some questions on that. I would say, just to wrap up, because I know you probably want us to go very quickly, some of the other main issues of contention and discussion that, again, received very limited feedback or movement was this idea of agriculture and food security. Really critical for G33 groups of countries, which encompasses quite a few developing countries, was a permanent solution that would allow governments to purchase and stockpile food to ensure food security. Despite many negotiating group discussions, there was no consensus reached. More in the area of procedural reform, there has been a continuing mandate for the WTO to try to fix reform. And in one of my pieces, I call it big reform, big R reform, and little reform. What do we mean by reform? Well, on the table has been trying to fix the dispute settlement system, which is, for the last couple of years, has really not had an appellate structure because of the continuous blockage for the appointment of appellate body members by a certain large country called the United States. A draft report had been created, more of a technical draft report by someone who was referred to as convener. And he, on his own volition, having done some negotiations and discussions, came up with a reform text for dispute settlement. And that was that made the rounds. Coming out of that was just a decision to continue the discussions. But on other areas of reform, like procedural reform, making some of the paperwork and the notification more transparent across WTO members, there was some agreement that nothing actually decided. But on reform on issues to bring in new issues that I care a lot about, and I'll talk about that later, like sustainability, like things like climate, things like bringing in reform of subsidies for industrial policy, women's issues, circular economy issues. There was very little movement on this, and there were some countries that proved quite intransigent in not bringing these new issues to the WTO when they say legacy issues that have bedeviled the negotiations of concern to developing countries have not moved. And I would just say lastly, the e-commerce moratorium. So this is a moratorium or an agreement not to allow customs duties for electronic transmissions. That moratorium was extended, so you're not allowed under the rules to have these duties on e-transmissions until the next ministerial conference, which will take place in Cameroon next year, or March 1st, 2026, whichever comes earlier. So there's a debate about whether some developing countries would like to start taxing these transmissions for greater money to their coffers. Many other countries say, no, we need to encourage this type of trade between countries so that we can expand the reach of digital produce and digital goods and services through these negotiations. So I'll stop here and hand it back over to you, Chair, and see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you. A lot to unpack there, and it's almost as if and any of these topics could have their own session, but segueing to or picking up on the issue of climate change, which you mentioned, this question is addressed to you, Keisha. For the Caribbean, the climate change crisis is viewed as an existential threat. CARICOM has recently appointed, for example, a climate envoy, and a number of organizations within the region are focusing on this issue. What is the mission, mandate, and primary objects of CCREEE? And if there's another way to pronounce it, you can correct us.
So it's called CCREEE, and you're absolutely right. It is a mouthful. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. But I think I would like to start off by saying thank you to you for having me today, and also say congratulations to the chair of our board, who's the person who was appointed as a climate envoy, Dr. Fletcher. And I know that he is more ready and able and excited about the opportunity, but I know that he's also going to represent the Caribbean really, really well, as he's done for the lifespan of his career. For a lot of persons, when I took on this position, and I'm actually brand spanking new, I started in January 6th, on January 6th, so we're a couple of weeks in. And if you were to equate each week to a minute, then I would say I'm about 5 minutes into the job, right? And yes, Janaik, I completely agree. He is an absolutely great advocate. I was just seeing the comments flashing across the screen. But CCREEE is actually the youngest CARICOM institution. It was established in 2018 and is dedicated to advancing the Caribbean's energy transition to sustainable energy future. And so we serve as a regional hub for accelerating renewable energy adoption and improving energy efficiency, as well as enhancing energy security. And as Jan was talking, was talking about food security, and food security as a real thing that the Caribbean really needs to get on top of, I would say energy security is right up there too as well. Because we are very much impacted by what's happening globally in terms of our energy demand and how much we pay for energy. And so energy security, very much like food security, for me, equates true Caribbean freedom. Despite the region's vast renewable energy resources and advancements that have been made, so for example, in Belize, they have 48% installed renewable energy capacity, which amounts to about 100 megawatts of installed capacity. Suriname is now at 46%. which amounts to about 189 megawatts installed capacity. And then we're closely followed by Barbados, which is 24%, and Dominica, which is 25%. You know, Caribbean nations are still heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. And of course, this is leading to high electricity costs. And of course, being very vulnerable to political and price shocks. I am Trinidadian, but I've been living in Barbados for a while. And I remember when I moved to Barbados, anybody who is from Trinidad or knows the cost of electricity in Trinidad, it is very, very, very cheap. If anybody lives in Barbados, they know that that is not the case, right? It is incredibly expensive. And so that cost, that, you know, there's a direct impact on cost of living. It's a direct impact on cost of energy. If you look at the other Caribbean islands as well, you know, the cost of energy is very high. And so how can we move to a space where we can basically free ourselves from that vulnerability to those external political and price shocks? As an organization, our goal is to look at how we can centralize and coordinate regional efforts. And so for us, energy resilience, as I said, looking at energy security and how we can integrate energy infrastructure planning, ensuring reliability in the face of climate-related disruptions. And I do think that while we have improved, I think in the past there's been a decoupling between climate issues and energy, as if they're two separate things. When in truth and in fact, those two things are very, very, very closely linked to each other. Whenever we look at, you know, disasters that are happening across the region, the first thing that goes is the energy infrastructure. And what that does is that you know, that takes a while to get back on stream, affects all of the other productive sectors, which then in turn affects GDP. And so when we're talking about the energy and energy security, we also need to take into consideration what a resilient energy infrastructure looks like in the wake of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And so one of the things I remember when in my previous role, what we were looking at is how do we build back resiliently? What's the cost of putting back up the poles above the ground versus putting the electricity lines underground, and how that directly impacts the cost per GDP in the case of when there's a natural disaster. We're also looking at how we can pool our resources and pool our strategy for procurement. When you look at the projects in the Caribbean, we are small island nations, and the demand is actually quite small when compared to other parts of the world. So how can we attract investment, and how can we compete with places that have a larger demand and that are more likely to attract investment? And so being able to create economies of scale, not only in the way that we develop projects, but also in the way that we procure for projects, can definitely make the region more attractive for investment. And so for us, that is a strategic direction that we are looking at taking. In terms of market development and investment facilitation, looking at how we can develop projects and make sure that our projects are ready to access that financing, and looking at how we can unlock financing mechanisms, not only through the traditional methods, you know, the donor agencies, etc., the IDBs, the CDBs, but also how we can attract private sector investment, as well as how we can use creative funding mechanisms like green bonds, etc., and energy bonds, to really stimulate the market within the Caribbean. And then, of course, looking at capacity building and knowledge sharing. So, for example, one of the initiatives that has done quite well with CWIT is the CARICOM Energy Knowledge Hub. And that knowledge hub is quite critical in terms of data and training resources. And I'm going to use this opportunity to make a quick plug for the launch of the app, which is coming very soon in April, where you can now access the CEKH, so the CARICOM Energy Knowledge Hub, on your mobile phone. And that hub is really rich with resources, not only just for academics and for persons within the policy area, but it also has learning resources for students. And so that's going to be a really exciting development on that end. And then, of course, I think as a big overarching vision, this vision of energy sovereignty, as I mentioned before, where we're not only just looking at sustainability, but that ability to decouple ourselves from the global shocks that are coming fast and furious, and by being able to reduce our reliance on imported fossil fuel, how we as a region can gain economic dependence and long-term resilience.
Thank you very much for that. I think you're transitioning from Jan's response to the first question, kind of focused on these what we can call fairly traditional trade issues to what have become increasingly important for us in the region, these kind of less traditional issues, climate change, and segueing now to the financial regime. So the question to you, Dawn, why is it important for the region to strengthen its ability to counter money laundering, financing of terrorism, and of weapons proliferation? And how can this need be better balanced against the phenomenon of de-risking, which we know is depriving the region's businesses and traders of access to global financial markets? What role can or does the CFATF, if there's another way to pronounce that, let me know, play in managing this balance?
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening to everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. I'm glad for the outreach and for CWIT asking the CFATF to be here. And you can say CFATF, and we often say CFATF. Calling out the entire acronym is a bit of a tongue twister also. So let me start with the last question first, and that is to say that the CFATF is an FSRB and FATF style regional body and part of a global network comprising approximately 206 countries. So our primary mandate is to ensure the implementation of the FATF standards, which deal with addressing money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing. And this is done through a process called a mutual evaluation process. So the system, the FATF standards are intended to protect the integrity of the international or global financial system from criminal abuse through money laundering, terrorist financing, and also proliferation financing. So it considers the money laundering and terrorist financing and proliferation financing risk that exists in each of the countries, their financial and non-financial sectors, and the products and services that those sectors provide. So that being said, in terms of the phenomenon of de-risking, which of course is affecting negatively the correspondent banking relationships of countries within the region and even globally, the FATF did a stock take in 2021 on the unintended consequences of the FATF standards, which of course is what we ensure that the countries are all implementing. And this showed that the main drivers for de-risking were first, profitability in terms of financial institutions, correspondent banks looking at their profit margin. Two, fear of supervisory actions, because as we know globally, there have been some massive fines against financial institutions. Banks reduced risk appetite. In other words, they think that the risk of doing business here isn't worth the profit that they could make, and reputational concerns. In the Caribbean context, the CFATF conducted its first stock-taking exercise on de-risking in 2019, and with data that was collected from 22 central banks and 227 financial institutions. And that study showed that 30% of those financial institutions were negatively impacted by de-risking. So the results also show that we know that the FATF standards and compliance, the cost of compliance has been an issue, but they identified some of the main reasons as the low volume or small profit margins within the regions. They're really, in terms of large financial sectors, even cumulatively, there's a low volume of transactions within the region, the cost of compliance, the AML-CFT policies and procedures, and the perceived risk of the jurisdiction in terms of its risk to money laundering and terrorist financing. Risk mitigation in terms of the correspondent banking mitigating their risk, lower risk appetite by those banks in general. This study that was done in 2019 was updated in 2023, and the results were similar. We had a larger amount of financial institutions and banks involved in that study, but they stated that, of course, the de-risking phenomena still continue to negatively impact their business operations. Naturally, the negative impact on business operations will also negatively impact trade, which is what your organization focuses on. So this is just to say that there is, in addition to the recommendations or the standards that the FATF require be implemented, there are other factors that facilitate the withdrawal of the correspondent banking relationships. And the CFATF basically tries to ensure that countries fully understand their risk, apply a risk-based approach so that they can convince the correspondent banks that they have measures in place, laws in place, regulations in place that address where the risk of money laundering or terrorist financing is, and therefore can protect whatever investments they may have or decide to have in the region. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I actually have a whole lot of follow-up questions in my head about that. So I encourage people to put questions in your chat. We will definitely make some time to get back to them. But let me see if let's go over to Vashti for the second round of questions.
Sure. Thank you so much. Apologies, I have been having some internet issues here, so I will not put on my camera. So round two, John, what hopes and expectations did the Caribbean have of MC13, and to what extent would they realize?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I think because, as I said in my first round, I tried to keep it on the guardrails of the WTO, but as I think I foreshadowed, there's so much happening outside the WTO, and that's not to give up on it. But I think for those who work day in, day out on WTO negotiations, it's a little bit now of a wait and see strategically to how things are actually going to progress in this year. And I want to kind of use that as maybe a leverage or a point of departure. So I mentioned the fisheries negotiations were stalled, and in particular, you had at the MC13 quite a lot of activity and action with spirited defense of interest by countries like the Caribbean. Barbados' minister was there, and the Fiji minister, I understood, were very vocal in trying to defend the interests of special and differential groups. So, the small island developing states in particular. I mentioned already the outcome of the e-commerce moratorium. I mentioned also the reform agenda. And I mentioned in a little, not as much as I usually do, a little bit about the sustainability agenda. And that encompasses, for those who work in that space, that encompasses the pillars of sustainable development, which in international economic law move from the environment to the economic to social dimensions. And certainly the social brings in much more of an inclusive approach to the traditional approach to trade, which is an assumption that by raising standards of living, you will have that trickle-down economic effect to those who are not necessarily the main beneficiaries of the market access that the trade rules seek to provide. But it's assumed that that will happen at the local and domestic level. And I think what we've been seeing for the past 5 or 6 years, especially in academia, is this pivot to bringing into the very core and sanctum of WTO rules and negotiations a consideration of these interests, not as byproducts, but as being themselves subject to negotiations. So things like, as I mentioned, climate, which has this huge impact on not the environment only, but also on welfare of persons and regions particularly negatively impacted. And we as SIDS have very particular dimensions there to articulate, and we've done that through negotiations on natural disasters that we tried to bring into the WTO. But it also extends to things like whether the WTO should start thinking about incorporating different criteria like vulnerability index or indices for determining when countries get favored negotiating appreciation at the different negotiations. Also women's issues or indigenous communities and groups that are also impacted negatively by the very phenomenon and climate change. Should that be a focal point of the negotiations? Also, reduction in fossil fuel subsidies. Again, we in the Caribbean may have very different views on that with the recent discovery of oil in certain of our islands where subsidies are provided. They may not run afoul of the rules, but the actual negotiations, should they actually take up these causes because of the needs of the Sustainable Development Agenda? And again, here you have at the WTO intractable positions because some of the developing countries are saying, well, yes, we want to discuss these issues at the WTO, but as I mentioned before, you haven't dealt with things like agriculture or services trade. You haven't dealt with developmental issues and things like special and differential treatment. These are legacy issues. So let's talk about these things first before we start talking about issues that seem to be of concern mostly to developed countries. Now, I stick a pin there because whilst it's being seen as an excuse for protectionism, some of these issues, and I'll talk a little bit about that, we're also seeing at the WTO quite forceful offensive positions by some developing countries like Ecuador, Costa Rica, even Fiji in outside negotiations is pushing for agreements relating to climate and sustainability because not only do they impact them possibly negatively, but also because they see opportunities for more competitive leapfrogging of their economies. So what if we were actually able at the WTO to negotiate agreements relating to market access for green or blue goods and services that actually will impact positively developing countries, because these are areas where we have access to the renewable energy raw materials, but also we have access to our sea and our ocean resources, and we have seaweed, and we have plastics alternatives and substitutes. What if the negotiations started to go in the way of looking at these newer, greener, bluer areas and provided avenues for greater market access for our countries? What's always in the room but never articulated clearly in trade negotiations is finance. And I think Keisha mentioned that, is that how do you get the investment and the financing necessary for these economies to actually do the developing and the growth to meet the needs of the green economy and the low carbon transition? So they're scattered around the negotiations, they're framing them. The nature of the positioning is not necessarily across the developed and the developing country traditional lines, because as I mentioned, there's some developing countries that are pushing that agenda, whilst others are saying this is not the remit of the WTO. So you asked where CARICOM sits here, and I'm not sure that we're seeing CARICOM countries necessarily very vocal in some of the climate plurilateral negotiations. So there is an avenue, and I won't get into all the technical jargon, but there are certain negotiations that willing countries can participate in, the plurilaterals relating to what they call the trade and environment structured discussions, also the fossil fuel subsidies discussions. And there are discussions on things like women in trade, MSMEs, which is small and medium-sized enterprises. Again, these are new issues for trade, not necessarily in the mainstream negotiations, but certainly they're bringing in a lot more of, I would say, an inclusive approach to trade, because the organization itself recognizes that leaving these things, as I mentioned before, just to member states to assume that these disadvantaged communities, small enterprises, women, SIDS will be positively impacted by the major negotiations has not necessarily been the case. So you asked about, and I'm going to just say very briefly, because I don't want to take too much more time, but what I would say are bright areas. And I'll leave for the third question a little bit about the geopolitics that is maybe framing trade in ways that we have to be very careful as CARICOM how we navigate right now. I would say that in 2024, in the negotiating space, what certainly attracted my interest because of the intersectionality between what I call traditional issues and these sustainable issues, the newer issues, were things like, for the very first time, we had a negotiation of the agreement on climate change and sustainability. I probably got that acronym a little mixed up, but it's the ACCTS agreement, which basically was negotiated. It started with 6 countries. It ended up with 4 being signatories. And these are sort of middling countries. They're not the big ones like the European Union and the United States and Canada and, the ones you expect. It was countries like Costa Rica, New Zealand. It started with even Fiji, Switzerland, Norway, who actually negotiated text to show the way of how trade can actually advance some of the climate considerations and imperatives of our time. So an agreement on the environment relating to market access for environmental goods and services was negotiated. Something relating to the reduction in fossil fuel subsidies. Other things, yes, Andrea, 30 seconds. Other things were also included in there that show the way. Carbon pricing, a huge standards issue, was sort of foreshadowed there. I would say also a major issue, not at the WTO, but impacting Caribbean countries, are negotiations at the International Maritime Organization. This is transport. There are huge risks that our costs of transports to decarbonize are going to go through the roof through the imposition of a levy. The negotiating position for the Caribbean is that we get the proceeds of these levies so that we can use it to actually decarbonize our shipping. And the last thing I would say negatively has impacted us is the EU's Green Deal and the CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And I'll leave that there because we've done some great work in the region on the impact of that, in particular on fertilizers and ammonia from Trinidad and Tobago. And because these measures which price carbon and impact our exports risk being spread in other markets like the UK, etc., this is going to impact some of our exports that are highly carbon intensive, and it will not be good for us. So I'll stop there and wait for the third round to get into some of the geopolitics that will impact our negotiating arena that that CARICOM should really look at very closely. Back to
Thank you
you.
so much, Jan. You give us enough material there for at least 4 more webinars. So, Keisha, I have some multiple questions for you, which I'm going to state one time. Please explain, what is the global energy transition outlook? Secondly, how does your organization align with it to strengthen its strategy, achieve its mission, and amplify its regional impact? And thirdly, what can you say about the possibility for increased business opportunities for local companies and industry?
This actually segues, and Jan, I really enjoyed listening to you. I was like, you could take some of my time. Because, I mean, there's really, it just segues perfectly into it, right? So the world is undergoing a major shift towards decarbonization, as Jan would have mentioned. Renewables are playing such a huge role in that shift, with energy security and economic growth at the heart of that. And when you look at the investment in green energy, it has reached record levels and is driven by advancements in technology and policy frameworks that are, as Jan was saying, favoring sustainability. But when you also look at green technology, it's actually more affordable than ever before. So for example, the cost of solar has dropped significantly within the last 5 years. So the price of, let's say, a solar voltaic module has decreased by 50%. And then compared to 10 years ago, that price has fallen by 80%. So that today, solar power install can cost as low as $1 per watt. So it's making it an increasingly viable solution for not just utility scale energy supply, but also for businesses and households alike. And we know, when you look at Barbados, and Barbados was definitely for many, many years one of the biggest uptakers of solar, with the solar heating for hot water on every single roof. And then, of course, Barbados taking that iconic policy decision to make renewable energy a human right, and then putting in place a policy structure that allow people to very quickly get permits, etc. And then the banks, the private sector banks, they came on board to provide financing for people to be able to put solar on their roof. So the Caribbean is in a place to leverage this global momentum. And in terms of how that then aligns with what CWIT is looking at and how we are aligning with global trends, we are adopting a globally recognized approach to this energy transition by aligning with the global network of regional sustainable energy centers, which is GNSEC. And they are a global initiative that supports regional organizations in promoting sustainable energy through capacity building, policy harmonization, technology transfer, and market integration. They're actually made up of 40 developing countries and 35 small island developing states. And they look at how they can foster this kind of collaboration between energy centers, and then, really push the adoption of renewable energy and energy efficiency in alignment with the global standards. And if you're looking at what that general approach looks like, and then you look at the type of projects that CWIT are involved in, you'd realize that there's a direct alignment between those pillars and our areas of work. So the sustainable energy transition and market integration, looking at not only just how we implement, but also on the policy side of things. And so how do we integrate the market with policy, and how do we promote cross-border cooperation? And that is a significant gap in the Caribbean in terms of policy development moving at the same pace with the market, right? So when you look at individual countries and you look at what their policy is, you would realize that there's a lot of work to be done. So for example, Bermuda took a very bold step 2 years ago, and they amended their very, very old Electricity Act in order to allow Bermuda to become what they are calling a sandbox for innovation. And of course, you've probably heard people talk about the Caribbean as being large ocean states rather than small island developing states. And so what that legislation now does is allow them to leverage the large ocean space that they have, and allow technology providers to come into the region and test in their waters different types of renewable energy solutions that are ocean-based, so OTEC. Of course, with the requisite environmental impact studies, et cetera. So they haven't left out that part of it. They've made sure that, there's environmental protection, there's social protection as well. But it meant a change in their legislation that had to be passed in cabinet. And so when you look at a lot of the policy frameworks, the laws, it has to be able to facilitate this energy transition. And then when you look at universal access and energy services, you hear people talking about a just transition, right? And so the just transition looks at not only just how we expand the infrastructure in order to onboard energy solutions, but how do you, and I always use Trinidad as an example. Every male member of my family, from as far back as my great-grandfather, have all worked in the oil industry. They have been some type of engineer. And when you look at Trinidad, We literally have universities. The University of Trinidad and Tobago was literally designed to churn out people for the oil industry. Our people are trained to service the oil industry. Even the ancillary services, the geologists, the marketers, the everything else, they all work in some way, shape, or form that's connected to the oil industry, to the fossil fuel industry. And so if you're talking about a just transition, if you're talking about taking everyone along on the journey, it's not just about making sure that, you know, the marginalized groups are included. It's also how do we retrain individuals to service this industry? How do we help those countries that are highly fossil fuel dependent to switch their economies in such a way that it doesn't implode, right? And that's a real possibility. And how do we prepare our young people for jobs of the future, right? So you're talking about, so for example, in Barbados, you know, being able to train persons at the local community college how to service EVs, right? That's not something that the traditional mechanic would have been able to do. How could we then onboard the traditional mechanics so that they also understand how to service EV vehicles and that kind of stuff? So looking at that universal access to energy services. And then when you look at the capacity building and the stakeholder empowerment element of it, you're looking at the education, the training, and the technical assistance programs that are not only at the national level, but also at the industry and community level. And so for a lot of our projects, we sometimes have to rely on outside technical expertise. So how do we get the Caribbean to the stage where we're not only onboarding new technology and having this energy jump, but we're servicing our own technology. We are the ones creating, we are the ones, we're not constantly going outside to get somebody to come in to do it for us, right? And so building that capacity across government and across the industry and sectors. Innovation, research, and technology development. If we're talking about, okay, Andrea, it's like 30 minutes, 30 seconds, right? So if we're talking about us becoming an ecosystem in which innovation is an innovative ecosystem as a region, we have to be in that space of innovation, research, and technology development. And then, of course, advocacy, awareness, and regional cooperation. We are preaching to the choir. Most of the people on this call are part of the choir. Most of the people that we meet in conferences are part of the choir. How do we bring the rest of the population along on the journey for them to see what's important? And then I think finally, I'll close off on something that Jan mentioned in her first remarks, is that intersectionality between energy and critical economic sectors. So energy, again, cannot be decoupled from the other sectors. For the Caribbean, those critical economic sectors is agriculture, tourism, and transport, right? And that transport includes not only just ground transport, but also sea transport as well, right? And so how do we bring them along on the journey? In terms of business opportunities and local companies and industries, I would say energy efficiency is such a low-hanging fruit. Businesses can increase their bottom line by investing in energy efficiency retrofitting with very simple measures: LED lights, smart cooling systems, building installations, and it comes out into real dollars and cents. So, for example, in the Caribbean, a medium-sized hotel, if they invest 50,000 US in energy efficiency upgrades, they can save approximately 15,000 US dollars per year on electricity costs. And then this results in a payback period of just about 3 years with long-term savings to enhance profitability. And the thing is, a lot of the tourists that we are getting now are so much more eco-minded. So they want to know that their hotel's carbon footprint is low. They want to know that there's some kind of green scheme. And so you're actually making your business more attractive by being more energy efficient. So I will pause there. There's a lot more that I could drone on about, but I will pause there and allow for the other panelists to make remarks.
Thank you very much, Keisha. I have to say, both you and Jan give me some hope. Earlier this week, I had a meeting with some business people who were wondering if ESG should still be a priority. So hearing you all, it really is heartening because I need to organize another webinar because we need to drill deeper, Andrea, and we need to drill deeper into the opportunities within the green and blue economies and do a roadmap of how pursuing these economies can help the Caribbean. So I'll now go to Dawn. Dawn, in the context of our discussion, how would you assess the strength of the region's financial regimes at this point in time?
Thank you, Vashti, for the question. I have to say the other panelists' discussion is very interesting. Something new to me in terms of the details of the concepts. And so I feel a little bit left field here. So what I can say is in the context of assessing the strength of the region's financial regimes, well, the region, of course, comprises small states. And I heard a new term in terms of whether it's large ocean states, which is an interesting concept, but they're small states, small countries with limited resources. There is only so much sand, sea, and sun that can be sold. So financial business is important to the region. And the region, of course, depends on international trade and investments. So in terms of de-risking, in terms of attracting investors, in terms of making sure that correspondent banking relationships are maintained, it is important for the region to have a strong AML CFT framework. The framework that we look at is split into two in terms of technical compliance and effectiveness. Technical compliance being the rules, the laws, the regulations, the guidance, the measures, the processes, and of course, effectiveness in terms of how well are those laws, measures, regulations, etc., being implemented. So to answer your question simply, I believe that the region has a very strong financial regimes in terms of AML CFT compliance, in terms of technical compliance, having laws in place, having regulations and measures in place, not only because of the work of the CFATF and the requirements to meet the FATF standards, but because they need to have strong measures in place to keep attracting investors, to keep trade going, to make sure that they're not gray listed, blacklisted, which will impact how business is done on a daily basis. So yes, it's strong and maybe stronger than many other larger countries, simply because the region needs to do so to remain competitive. We actually have two countries in the region who have all their technical compliance recommendations rated compliant or largely compliant, which is a good achievement. We have others who are in similar positions based on our rating scale with no recommendations rated non-compliant. So I am proud to say and pleased to say, and there's also a re-rating process, which I wouldn't get into. That can be a webinar on its own. But if you look at our website, you would see that the countries are generally doing well in terms of their level of compliance, in terms of their ability to be secure and safe and manage the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing from a technical and process point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. Andrea, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Very passionate contributions, and our presenter for the next panel has joined us. So we are going to go on to this last question though, but we are going to be a little stricter with time. So I'm going to ask each panelist to take 2.5 minutes to look ahead to 2025 and pulling from some of the things that you have said, right? What are the key issues that you would recommend that the region focus on in 2025? Do we need WTO negotiations to get market access for green and blue goods? How can the work of CWIT facilitate this? How much uptake are you seeing of the solutions that you mentioned? And then for Dawn, not necessarily for Dawn, but I'm putting this out there to all of you. Is there any hope for any of this if we don't improve or stop the flight of our banking systems and services from the region? It's good to hear that we're on track in terms of the legal framework. Now can we start attracting more banks and improved financial services to the region? So I'm going to start with you, Dawn. Let's reverse it, and we'll end with Jan. So let's start with you, Dawn.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so that's a surprise, but yes, going forward, and what's important for the region, of course, is to keep their foot on the gas in terms of compliance, in terms of strengthening their money laundering, anti-money laundering, um, countering terrorist financing and proliferation financing frameworks, and to remain resilient in that regard. So to avoid any, major scandals in terms of the financial system, which fortunately we have not had, that has negatively impacted the region as a whole. And I think that's because we have good supervisory and regulatory institutions that ensure that they monitor and keep a tight rein on the activities that happen within the region. So they need to continue in that regard in order to ensure that we remain strong, but also improve in terms of implementation of those measures, illegal measures, because that is where there is a bit of a gap from our perspective in the region. And that gap is what then leads to listing of some of the countries, either gray listing or blacklisting based on the processes that they are in place. So I think that's what is needed is going forward. I'd just like to say and plug that we're at the end of our fourth round. Our fifth round of assessments is beginning. And so countries need to focus on addressing the deficiencies that we would have found in their systems and basically to do better in terms of effective implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. To you, Keisha.
You're on
Keisha,
mute.
are you able to unmute?
I am able to unmute. You would think by now we would get this, right? All these years of being on Zoom, that we would remember to unmute. What I was saying very quickly was that Vashti, absolutely yes. Please tell your businesses that they need to be on board with ESG, particularly if they're looking for any type of financing. And it's not just like financing from outside, because what's happening with financiers from outside and banks like CIBC, etc., because they're part of a larger global network, they have standards that they need to meet, and they need to show that their entire pipeline, the entire value chain is also compliant with ESG standards. So it's actually linked directly to your ability to be able to get funds, and it will be more so linked into the future. And Dawn, you mentioned that what you said is left field, but I actually don't think it isn't. I mean, I actually don't think it is, because when we look at investment in the region and people who are attracted to the region, they are attracted to the region because we're stable. What we need to work on in terms of bringing finance into the region is being able to create that unified renewable energy market. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on for 2025. We're calling it CARICOM's Energy Uprising, focusing on how we can attract global investment, because they are already interested because we're a stable market. But how could we create an environment where it is the ease of doing business, which is something completely different, needs to be put in place, but also we need to be able to scale our create scalable projects, have competitive pricing, and a strong political commitment. And Prime Minister Mia Mottley's appointment as chair of CARICOM is definitely going to have a very positive impact on the regional energy transformation. And so we're really looking forward to that. So the goal is to lower costs while simultaneously enhancing resilience and sustainability across CARICOM states.
Thank you very much, short and sweet. Jan, last but by no means least.
I'm gonna try to be short, Andrea. Hold me to it. You can interrupt me.
Okay.
So I'm actually gonna try to triangulate our three submissions or perspectives, and I agree completely with Keisha Dawn that finance is actually the biggest key to unlocking the opportunities in trade, investment, energy. And one thing I would say is you seem to have the Caribbean countries, governments, processes on lockdown when it comes to the money laundering and the counter terrorism sort of work. I think one of the bigger issues, and I don't know to what extent that falls within your remit, is the cost of finance. The cost of finance. The opportunities, Keisha, in the renewable sector may be rife, maybe in theory and potentially so great. But we're still, at least in the trade side, and a little bit investment, hearing that the cost of doing business
It
in these
is.
regions are huge. And that's why Bridgetown Agenda needs to have a special part that deals with investment and trade. I've been trying to get Bridgetown Initiative to take on trade and investment a little bit more frontally, because I believe if we create competitive markets to get green, blue goods, services ready for export, because we get more investment, and that could be regional export or international export, and we don't have the necessary finance to do it, and we don't have the markets that are open to do it, we're actually not going anywhere. And so that's why you need the global trade rules and investment rules to be favorable to these types of investments. And to bring it now to the WTO, Andrea, your question is that's why we invest in the WTO negotiations. It's not a lost cause, because whilst all the geopolitics is happening, the bread and butter work of the WTO still remains harmonizing, making mutually operational and operable standards, ESG. So this is the environment and all of the governance standards coming out from unilateral countries like the EU and the US and all of these, and the OECDs, all of them, they create costs if we can't comply with them. And part of the work of the WTO is, one, to make these standards more harmonized so that little countries, little businesses, little economies like ours don't have to bear such a high cost of complying with the standards because they're part of making the standards, or they get funding and they get the financing to comply with the standards. So it's all very linked. And my last comment, Andrea, before you take me off, is the WTO, everyone right now is in a little bit of a watch game. They're trying to see what's going to happen with Trump, with the EU, with China. And I would just put in a plug, since everybody's plugging, that Andrea and I will be on next week, Tuesday, to look at what is the impact of the US policy with Trump 2.0 on Caribbean relations. That's the SRC with CPC. Is going to talk more on that. So I'll leave that alone and say, come and listen to that, because we'll get more into the details of that discussion. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Janice. Thank you very much, Dawn. Thank you very much, Keisha. Vashti, in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that we move immediately to the next panel, and then we do save the thanks and summaries for the very end, and I'll let you close out instead. So let me, it is actually an excellent segue to our next panel, which is going to be just pinning. Nope, that's the wrong person. My goodness, sorry. Is if someone can bring her, Vashti, if you're able to bring up Dr. Martinez for me, that would be great. Dr. Jacqueline Laguardia Martinez is a senior lecturer at the Institute of International Relations at University of the West Indies, and she is going to lead the discussion of our second panel, which is the Caribbean and the new Cold War. Among the questions that she will be discussing is, American analysts, they're the ones who have begun to speak of this new Cold War, with the US and NATO on one side against Russia and China on the other. Of course, we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we have the US-China economic rivalry as the primary underpinnings. The old Cold War had imposed a bipolar worldview to the detriment of the Caribbean and other developing states. Is this going to be true of the new Cold War? Is there such a thing as a new Cold War? What would this mean for the Caribbean? And in particular, what are the implications for the Caribbean of US-China rivalry? How can the region position itself to advance its own interests? So those are a lot of questions, and we're inviting Dr. Martinez to address any and all of those that she chooses to. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sorry I couldn't join from the beginning of the session, but I was in class before. So I'm really happy I was able to listen to the last part of the previous panel. And I will try to the best of my capacities in 15 minutes to address the very complex question that you have sent to me as, let's say, to a provocation to a very, I believe, interesting and meaningful conversation for the Caribbean. I'm going to try to share the screen. I don't know if I will be able to do it. Let's see if I can share, because I have a very short presentation, just a few
All right,
slides.
Yes,
let's
I
make sure
just
that
give
you
you
can.
rights to
Okay, great, great.
Okay, so let me go and share it. And okay, let's see. Okay, let me know if you can see it. I hope you can.
Yes.
Okay, so very briefly, I will, as I said before, I will try to address these key questions that were sent to me to this final panel. The first has to do with the title of the panel that I found it fascinating. Is there a new Cold War? And as you have already indicated, there is a lot of discussion about if we should be calling this new moment that we are living today a new Cold War or not. And we can see a lot of new books and authors that are actually using the term to rename or to name and to call this new momentum where we have these powers that are fighting for the certain hegemony around the world. We have, of course, the US and this conflict with China, but we also have Russia. So a lot of combinations trying to address this moment of conflict and confrontation, basically confronting the US and China. What is interesting to see first is that this term of the new Cold War has been used before this moment we are living now. And actually, if we go a little back on time, since the end of the Cold War, different authors were trying also to reposition the Cold War under the calling for the new Cold War, describing different conflicts around the world. Even when we have the new Cold War used to study the changes in the former USSR and how the Soviet Union was dismantled. So maybe that was a justification to call for a new Cold War. Also, the term was used when trying to analyze the rising of religious nationalisms around the world. And even Noam Chomsky talked about the new Cold War when analyzing US foreign policy. So as you can see, we are in front of a term that is actually contested, and we don't know exactly if it's going to become accepted to describe what is going on today. I believe, and I would like to start here, that I believe that we are not necessarily in the present of a new Cold War. And it does not mean that the moment we are living is not full of complexities. And definitely for the Caribbean, it is very important to be aware and to understand what this new period of changes that we are living will mean and already means to the region. We are different from the Cold War time. We are in a moment where there are multiple states trying to achieve and trying to define a dominant position around the world. And this is quite different from that moment where we can remember that they were very well established, two sides, two groups, two dominant perspective, and a lot of minor different countries surrounding this major confrontation between the East and the West. Today, we also have more other political actors that are also trying to reaffirm their active participation in the global system. The multiplicity of regional organization, the more mature multilateral system that we have today compared to what we had at the end of the 20th century is also making a difference. Today, even the hegemony of states is openly challenged, and that was not the case when it was clearly seen in the moment of the Cold War and the capacity of states to be the major political actors, and of course, redefining the system of alliances. And this is quite important, especially for the Caribbean. We are living in a moment where in certain contexts, states are even unable to exert the monopoly of violence. That is one of the defining characteristics of modern states. And we have that challenge in the situation, the very complex situation that we are facing in Haiti today. There are other elements that are bringing a lot of instability to the system that we didn't have during the Cold War. The Cold War, we had certain, a wide amount of predictability in terms of political trends. Today, this is not that clear. The boundaries are not clear. The system of alliances are not clear. And a different and key element is that the two actors that are supposed to be the main elements in conflict, China and the USA, are very much interdependent. And that was not the case between the USSR and the US and the system of alliances that existed before. So all these ideas of China and the USA having this economic war and decoupling is going to be costly for both of them. And there are a lot of interest invested on trying to manage the situation in a different way. Nevertheless, the point is that this is a complex period. But the complexity, I don't believe, could be similar, and it's not resembling what we had before. There are new elements, there are changes, there are transformations that are putting us in front of a different moment, and our capacity to understand that is going to be at the center of the quality and the responses that we will be able to design and implement coming from the Caribbean. Among the changes that are going to be making the difference that we need to consider to understand our position and how we can react and how can we accommodate and how we can survive and how we could even be an important part of this new moment. I believe that some of the elements that we need to consider are the following. First, there is a change in the global economy dynamism. The Atlantic is not the relevant sea anymore, the relevant ocean anymore. This dynamism has moved to the Pacific. And that is going to have an impact in the Caribbean in terms of the relevance that the Caribbean had in the past when it comes to the discussion of major trade routes and economic exchanges. Also, we are now confronting very rapid and huge technological changes. There is a conversation about the fourth industrial revolution, and what we are witnessing today are major transformations in how energy is produced and how knowledge is produced and is managed. And that is, of course, going to have impacts, very large impacts in how societies are organized. So all the discussion about sources of energy, all the discussions about artificial intelligence that are central in the transformation that we are having today, we need to be aware of what it means on how the economic process is organized and is redesigned. That is also having an impact in how we communicate. That is also having an impact on how societies and how political systems are functioning today. The amount of vulnerabilities that we are facing today in terms of the environmental vulnerabilities has increased tremendously. In the Caribbean, we are very much aware of what climate change is and what it is doing to our societies. And also, we are living in a moment where, different from the Cold War, there are very well identified areas where there are hot wars. We have armed conflict, we have civil conflict, we have interstate conflicts. So this moment of change and transformation also has the danger and has the challenge of escalating into interstate conflicts that could expand and that could be quite a danger or a menace for areas like the Caribbean. Another element today that it is central for the region is the emergence of what we might call medium powers. So, and one of the most widely known example are the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries that is very diverse within, because we have Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now the group has enlarged. We are talking about a group of emerging powers that are also redefining the system of alliances around the world. And we need to be also we need to be knowledgeable of how we reshape and how we understand our foreign policy, considering all these myriad of different powers, especially because there is not necessarily a consensus or a unique way of establishing this system of alliances. Even within the BRICS, we can see major difference between these countries. So part of that is, all of that is adding complexity on the moment that we are living and how to understand potential conflicts and how we need to position ourselves in this challenging and changing global scenario. So what is here for the Caribbean? First, a large discussion is what is the Caribbean, but we don't have time to go to that. So the Caribbean, I'm going to be referring now, is going to be the CARICOM Caribbean. And that is going to be looking into the 14 independent states that are full members of the Caribbean. And considering that there is a tremendous diversity in these 14 states that are here, what I tried was to understand I assume the regional perspective for the analysis and try to identify what are the key elements for the CARICOM Caribbean to take into account in its relationship with China and the US, and how to prepare and react for the implications of this changing world, with definitely China and the US are emerging as major global powers. First, the Caribbean foreign policy has been usually characterized by highly and I believe sophisticated use of pragmatism based on the rules of multilateralism. And this is consistent with the characteristic of young states that are also small island developing states. For the Caribbean, it is central to maintain the rules of the multilateral order and to maintain the rules of states being respected, recognized, the Pacific coexistence of states. All these center pillars of multilateralism are at the core of Caribbean foreign policy and can inform the region's reaction to most of the conflicts that are happening today. Following to that, there is a preference for non-alignment of Caribbean countries and trying to establish a system with multiple alliances. Of course, that could be difficult to maintain in a scenario of sharp confrontation. But what I'm talking here is I'm trying to establish what are the foreign policy trends and how the region has been able to practice foreign policy and being successful by doing that. When we look at China and the US, the Caribbean has, of course, two different positions. First, the US is recognized as a major economic partner for the CARICOM Caribbean. Is the major trade partner. There's also a large cooperation in security. We have an important Caribbean diaspora living in the US. Our exchange to the world, trade investment is mostly dominated by the US dollar. The financial system in the Caribbean is very much attached to the US dollar, and the Caribbean sees important also for the US. So look into this relationship from both sides. Even if the Caribbean might not be a strategic area of interest of the US, is not totally irrelevant. So that is also something that we need to take into account, especially when looking into the US understanding of its national security. What could be challenging for the Caribbean today is that there is no clarity in what the US policy towards the CARICOM Caribbean is. We had some hints at the 9 summits of the America in 2002, but now we have a new administration in the US. What will be the approach to the CARICOM Caribbean? That is something that is not clear yet. Going to China, we can see that China has a minor trade presence compared to the US in the region. However, it has been winning positions when it comes to development cooperation and investment for development loans and credits. Most of CARICOM member states have signed the Memorandum of Understanding to being part of the Belt and Road Initiative. There are a few exceptions into that path. First, the Bahamas, they have not signed, as far as I know, the MOU, but they have agreements, economic agreements with China. And of course, nor Belize, nor Haiti, nor St. Kitts and Nevis, nor St. Lucia, nor St. Vincent, because part of the complexity of the Caribbean relation with China is that these 5 countries do not have diplomatic relations with China. They have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So that is an element of complexity for the region to react as in consensus towards China and to engage with China. Different from the US, there is certain consistency to the approach of the Chinese government towards the Caribbean. They have published 2 policy papers that can give us a guidance of what the purpose are and what they would like to achieve in the region. Looking at that, what will be the potential frictions that we might expect out of the relations that we have with the US and China and what might emerge in the future. By what we have seen recently, we can see that there are going to be these encounters related to the position around climate change. What is the position of the new administration in the US towards the Paris Agreement? Very different from what is the one that the Caribbean defends. In terms of cooperation in areas like health, in terms of cooperation in general, definitely we might expect some frictions. The issue of migration, of course, compared to absolute numbers, the amount of CARICOM nationals in the US are not of the, it's not a large number compared to other Latin American and other nationalities, but of course, that could be a point of friction with the US if that deportation in mass actually takes place. There could be these encounters when it comes to how to proceed to remedy, to find a sustainable and fair solution to what is going to Haiti. And the conflicts around technology might can become more acute, especially some conflicts that we have had already around the using of the 5G that has been part of the conflict between the US and China in the region. In the case of China, the main potential frictions is, of course, that there is no a regional position towards China. There are countries that do not have diplomatic relations with China. Also, in the Caribbean, we have had a lot of criticisms to Chinese practice when it comes to investment, loans, and credits, market penetration. So all of that could be part of the potential frictions that we might face in this escalating conflict and presence of China and the US. So I will finalize with some idea of how can we prepare, what to do in this changing world where China and the US are definitely emerging as poles of power around the world. And so definitely I believe that the wise strategy is to be prepared to what it might come. First, it will be, and none of these recommendations are new. We have been talking about that extensively before. It could be useful for the Caribbean to nourish alternative partnerships. So that major dependence that we have and connection that we have with US economy is something that should be revisited. It could be useful for us to diversify our economic partners, our trade partners, trying to find alternative source of investment. Of course, it is easier to say than to do, but if we do not have a clear policy, it will be difficult to attract and to engage in relationships with other partners. We have a weak relationship with Latin America, that is our immediate neighbor. Our relation with Asia and Africa that are gaining economic importance because of the vibrant economic activity that is happening there. We are not necessarily promoting relation with these markets, with this country, that of course they are far away compared to Latin America, but still could be some room to explore some an increased economic exchange. And our relationship with the European after Brexit has not been necessarily relaunched, especially in terms of cooperation and access to some development funds. There is also the need to relaunch our own regional projects. I believe that now we live in a moment that is critical for CARICOM to actually advance, especially the CSME. There is a role to play by the Association of Caribbean States, especially when it comes to promoting multinational, multi-destiny tourism, the promotion of transportation alternative. Our transportation and communication routes are extremely insufficient, and definitely this is a weakness that the region has. Well, I already talked about promoting intra-regional trade, and what I'm saying that in option 3 has to do with trade within the Caribbean, still quite weak. We still work in terms of competition, not necessarily complementarity, something that definitely needs political action because, again, it's not happening just because. The Caribbean should be consolidating leadership position at the global issue. There are areas that the Caribbean has shown capacity to mobilize attention and to establishing norms and codes for action. I'm thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about the proposal for reform of the financial architecture, the Bridgetown Initiative. Definitely, those are very commendable efforts that needs to be supported and continued. And finally, there is the need for the region to have strategies to reduce not only economic dependence, but the many dependencies that we still have. That becomes a major source of vulnerability. What is going to happen with the process of energy transition that we have announced, the policy for energy transition that we have announced in CARICOM? How are we going to promote food security? How we are going to rely on endogenous and domestic technologies? How we are going to have not only national security and environment with less crime, but to diminish transnational crime? The climate change, what are our own strategies for mitigation and mostly adaptation, and how we are going to build financial resilience. Those are part of the clear strategies that we need to design and to implement if we want to be prepared for the very complicated world that we are going to face. I mean, that we are already facing and that we will continue to face in the coming years. So I will stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeoman's task in such a very concise and you addressed a number of very complex and comprehensive issues in a very concise manner and in such a short space of time. Thank you very much. And that is true of all our panelists. We are a little bit over time, but if folks, I am not seeing any questions in the chat. A very, very quick reminder to folks that you can put any quick comments. Maybe we could take 1 or 2 questions. And then also a reminder before I turn it over to Vashti to close out that you can learn more about CWIT and join CWIT by using the link that we're going to be putting in the chat. So let me turn things over to you, Vashti, to close out.
Yeah. So before we close off, we were going to do some interesting things in terms of launching 2 poll questions. So let's try.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, 2 questions if you can vote on it, because we wanted the session to be interactive, and we here at CWIT is also learning and playing around with the technology. So I'll just give you, while you all poll in the interest of time, I will do my closing remarks. As we close this insightful discussion this evening, it is clear that 2024 has been a pivotal year for Caribbean trade, shaped by global shifts in multilateral negotiations, energy transitions, and financial security. The conversations this evening have reinforced the need for regional resilience, strategic positioning, and proactive engagement in shaping our trade and economic future. As we look ahead to 2025, collaboration remains essential across all sectors, borders, and industries to ensure that the Caribbean is not just responding to global trends, but actively influencing them. We saw that in Keisha's presentation tonight. Thank you to our panelists, Keisha, Jan, Dawn, and indeed, okay, so continue pulling, please. Thank you to all our esteemed panelists, our audience, and our Caribbean Women in Trade Network for fostering such a rich exchange of ideas. Let's continue this momentum in the year ahead. Look out, also I put into the chat, we are running a survey. If you can take some time to complete, it will take no more than 7 minutes. And if you can also share with your network, please.
All right, so we are ending the formal portion of the event. At CWIT, our members and participants tend to like to hang on for a little bit more. So I'm going to stop recording, but folks are free to stay on and to continue to access the polls, check out the link to join CWIT and to chat informally. Our panelists, of course, are free to stay on or to leave as you see fit. Thank you very, very much again.